Thank you very much. It's really great to be here. And this is a very important subject, very close to my heart. I have, just to warn you, just found out that I can't see what my next slide is going to be. I sort of assumed that. So that's my bad. I shouldn't assume. So I'm going to try and do this, but without knowing exactly what the next slide is. So I think when we use the word misinformation, we kind of know that there's a sort of a context in which we think about and imagine that there's a misinformation crisis. And I think it's pretty hard, given the last 2 years of serious public health crisis, and then, of course, all of the various other things that were happening before that. There was the Trump victory in 2016 in America. There was Brexit. There's all sorts of other things where the public's understanding of key information and desire to carry on pushing things that were provably not true is quite clearly a problem. So we have some kind of observable misinformation crisis. But in the context of those various things that were happening, I began to notice, as I was finishing a book about social media, that there was also a misinformation crisis, if you like. That actually the very issue of misinformation itself was also terribly misunderstood. There was quite a lot of sort of blaming of technology solely for the problem, or very specifically singling out certain kind of foreign actors within the kind of geopolitical arena, certain kinds of things. Or it's the naughty populists who are responsible for all of this. And, this is kind of historically amnesic and just very selective and generally rather kind of disingenuous. So I set out writing another book, making another project to try to get to the bottom of this. And one of the things that I really felt was a problem at the beginning of this process was this phrase, fake news. It's kind of generic term that we use, that we throw around to talk about this kind of crisis of something. Unreliable or inaccurate information. You hear people say all the time, oh, that's fake news, that's fake news. And now, I don't know about here, but certainly in the UK, it's almost become a bit of a joke. In the UK, we kind of make everything into a joke. So maybe that's why. But it's like, oh, that's fake news. And you can kind of use it ironically. But it's actually rather unhelpful because it's sort of blocking the way we really understand this problem. Fake news is fake news, in a way. It's a kind of misinformation. And so I wanted to kind of go deeper into this and just really to kind of get people thinking about misinformation in a different sort of way. So that's what I want to tell you about. So we create fake news as a sort of pantomime villain. It's a kind of constructed, rather sort of superficial character in our story. Easy to blame. If you're a populist leader, you can say, oh, that's fake news. If there's information out there that you don't like, you can kind of point at it that way. If someone gets elected and you hate them and you don't know why they got elected and this is terrible, then you can say, oh, well, the only reason this could possibly have happened is because fake news. And so it's this kind of, that's the first problem with it. It's just a very easy thing for us to use. The second problem with it is that it kind of redirects our interest towards journalism, towards news production specifically. Now, I'm not known for letting journalists off the hook, but I think this is a little unfair because there is a lot of bad journalism out there, but there's an awful lot of other problems and things that kind of fit into the way we kind of think about this crisis as well. And so part of what I have been trying to do is to broaden that picture. So when we think about fake news, we tend to have specific ideas in mind. I mentioned bad journalism, that's one of them. But we also have a few other things as well. Conspiracy theories, very common. Everyone loves to talk about those. And there's a chapter on them in my second book. I've had so many interesting conversations, including with conspiracists, where maybe we don't agree, but it's just very interesting to learn about their worldviews. Then, as I mentioned, there's these kind of often populist leaders. I call it reactionary denialism. But there's this sense that, like, if you don't like something, whether it's being asked to wear a mask, which you're all doing very, very nicely, or something else, you can just say, well, that's fake. That is something I can just deny it outright and make it not part of my reality. There is obviously government disinformation. That's a big problem in the world. Although, and all governments do it. Then we have usually something to do with social media thrown in there. And, if you read a little bit more about it, maybe you also kind of hear about some pesky teenagers in Velez, North Macedonia, who, realized that they could make money publishing actual fake news or articles on the internet. So these are things that we do hear about. These are all kind of little parts of the problem, but there's a lot that we don't talk about, which is the kind of misinformation about misinformation problem that I was referring to earlier. So I kind of want to just throw some of those things into the mix, first of all. We often don't include corporate disinformation. Now, Volkswagen might feel offended that I've put their logo here. Many corporations do this. I'm only thinking of the diesel emissions cheat devices scandal as one particularly good example of this. Obviously, advertising, we're sold all sorts of products that don't work and have never worked, and we buy them happily anyway, various cosmetics and food supplements and all these kinds of things. That's a huge market. The attention economy, the fact that actually it isn't the veracity or the quality of what you're looking at, it's simply the fact that you are looking at it that is now the kind of thing that is traded and commodified and that, leads to the value of a social media platform going up or down. Very, very often you hear kind of people have been influenced in terms of the way that they're thinking about things by stuff they're seeing, in various thrillers and stuff like that. I mean, I'm probably giving away my generation, my age, but X-Files is, incredible to look at that and the connection between that and some of the conspiracy theories that people believe. Sense-making, I think we all do this. When you're anxious, when you're trying to kind of make sense of the world, you need to fill in the gaps. And that's a huge driver of misinformation as well. And it's a very human thing that we kind of need to do. And another thing which is really commonly overlooked is the fact that who you think you are and who you think you belong with socially is capable of conditioning what you can convince yourself to believe. So these are kind of really important factors that get left out. And so what I've been trying to do is to kind of replace this with a much more kind of holistic way of thinking about misinformation as one big picture, as one kind of system, but not just having one buzzword that you kind of just throw at everything every time you kind of don't understand why people believe this or why they do that. It is one big picture, and we can and we should be kind of pulling that all together. I'm just going to have some water here. That's kind of what my work has been about. Joined up thinking has its kind of merits when, you have a lot of time on your hands or whatever, and it's generally something that, you have to kind of really push for because the world is always pushing back. There's a sort of what Baudrillard called negative entropy, where things are always being constantly simplified and simplified. And so actually, it's really important that we try to make this kind of connected up knowledge. And the only people who are doing this really, and they're often doing it wrong, actually there's two classes of people. One of the only groups of people who are doing this, although they do it wrong and they get their facts wrong almost all of the time, are conspiracy theorists. They're very good at thinking about how everything is connected. The other people who do this, and no one listens to them quite often, are the really kind of talented investigative journalists whose names we probably ought to know but don't. But generally, society is not very good at thinking about how things are connected. And so there's intrinsic benefit in that. But there's also, when you have such a large problem like this, you basically won't understand it unless we connect everything together. So the way I've tried to kind of organize it, and this, no system of categories or factors or anything is perfect. So this is just a framework, really. But the way I've tried to organize this is through three things, interlocking factors. The first is people. So, one of the things that was really surprising to me when initially I got kind of interested in this is like when you're trying to convince people that, I don't know, Pope Francis supports Donald Trump or something else completely ridiculous, why were people so vulnerable to believing that to begin with? Why was that completely ridiculous thing? Why were people suggestible in that direction? So that's the people question. Then there's all of these issues around how media are made and who's making them and why they're making them, which is incredibly important. And then another thing that, again, the conspiracy theorists are usually the ones who are doing this and they're always doing it wrong, is talking about power. It's like left-wing theorists and conspiracy theorists are the only ones who want to talk about power. I'm in the former group, but not the latter. But anyway, so then we have these three things, and what can we do with them? So if it's not too academic, I wouldn't mind going through these in a bit more detail, and then we can put them together, and then we can start to sort of make sense of this kind of whole picture of misinformation and how it fits together. So let's talk about people. And I mentioned some of these issues earlier, but I want to kind of drill down into them a little bit more now. So suspicion is a really huge one, because it's something that almost none of us are immune from. Right? We've all got our suspicions about those in power, or, oh, I don't want to buy that product, it might not be good for me, or that guy on TV, he's a liar, or almost none of us don't have those kinds of beliefs. And this is a hugely potent driver of our political reasoning, of the kinds of things we're willing to believe, or more importantly, not believe. And, you know, I've got 2 whole chapters on it because suspicion is just fascinating the more you kind of go into it. Resentment is another one, a lot more kind of studied sociologically. Again, for most of us have some kind of lingering political resentments, you know, or if not, we probably should, because there's plenty to be angry about as far as, you know, the way the world has gone. Belonging, I mentioned that earlier, but this is a really important one. Anxiety, again, that sort of drives sense-making. Fatigue, you know, again, people work so hard. I mean, I come from London, which is a city where everyone's always in a hurry and everything is kind of always under pressure, and the kind of work rate is just really hard for people to keep up with. And so if you're working, you know, whether it's in a law firm or in a factory, you know, and you're working 12-hour days and you're kind of just having every last drop of energy squeezed out of you by your employer, you may not have time to plow through all of the kind of investigative reports and things that are being provided for you to learn about the world. And there's no judgment there, but that is a factor. Another one, which, you know, I have to kind of be careful talking about this. We are all illiterate with respect to certain things in the world and how they work. There is nobody who kind of has this, you know, literacy about everything. But the problem is that over time that's getting worse because of that kind of simplification process I mentioned. When I say literacy, I don't literally mean reading and writing. I mean the sense of, like, you can know facts, but you can also know how they fit together and how they exist kind of in motion. And there's a certain sort of functional literacy about the world that interests me there. And boredom is a huge one as well. People are bored. So actually, one of the things you notice between conspiracy theories that people do believe and the actual investigative reports that are coming out about this corporation or that government is that the actual truth that's being reported is quite often quite boring. I mean, it's outrageous, but it doesn't have aliens or lizards or any of those kinds of much more exciting characters in it. And so that's not necessarily going to drive people towards the things that they might really need if they want to actually know what the truth is. So that's the people factor. Then there are a number of kind of overlapping things to do with the way media are made and distributed, which are also really important. Of course, media are made for people, and particularly with the attention economy. Attention economy means kind of trying to get people to watch and read and view the things that you're making as much as possible. The more viewers and people you have on your site, the better, or how more followers you have on your Instagram, whatever it is. This is all about kind of attention having a sort of, not only an intrinsic value, but also being something that, you know, at the kind of large scale, companies like Meta and Twitter and Google and so forth, that's really what they trade. So, you know, that's audience driven, right? So the people in the last slide mean that the media is then being kind of made for them, supposedly to give as much of their attention as possible. And of course, alongside that, there's, you know, as we know from work of Shoshana Zuboff, Aral Balkan, and many other people, a lot of surveillance and data collection around that to ensure that the attention of those people can be targeted as much as possible and fed into various timeline algorithms so that you see certain posts and not others and things like that. So that's hugely important. There is, as I mentioned, the scale. This is historically unprecedented, right, as far as what social media have done for us. There's always been viral media. There's always been, audiences and media and all those kinds of things. But the kinds of scale that you can get now are historically unique. And so that's very important. Crucially, we know from the kinds of things that are being said about those platforms, but also more conventional media, going all the way back to Chomsky and Herman in '84, kind of talking about who owns media and what their connections are in terms of the various narratives that they want to push. And then finally, the fact that if you are driven by an attention economy, quality does not pay. So there's that, and then I need to kind of hurry up a little bit here. There's also power. So the fact that whether it's corporations or governments, you have declining accountability, flawed electoral systems, spin. A lot of these are topics that I know are being discussed in other talks and things that people are giving. And I think this is a huge one, focusing on retaining your powerful dominant position within this overall picture, and using secrecy to do so. So we kind of know that. But here's the thing. If you think about the people who are responsible for this, what do they know? They know that actually they know about this. They know about these people. So then what you realize is the whole thing is not just 3 categories. It's actually a cycle, right? So, people and their circumstances we've talked about, right? The media is made for them, right? And then media quite often is made and conditioned and shifted and so forth by those in power, who know that these people aren't going to have time for plowing through all of the truth and all the kind of minute details and those kinds of things. And so you get this cycle. And the cycle goes around and around and around and around. And over time, over several decades even, that has a really serious deteriorative effect on the kind of condition of our informational landscape. It's what's brought us to this point where we have this kind of misinformation crisis. And the sort of elephant in the room, I think, is that what makes this possible, what's kind of in the center of this, is the fact that, all of this is kind of organized around, whether it's people as employees, whether it's kind of governments having a very close relationship to corporations, whether it's media kind of being mostly funded by advertisement. You can always find a link to basically this being kind of something that's organized around the interests of certain kind of financialized capital. Even if you look at the kind of digital, the huge digital platforms are amongst the world's biggest companies now, and they also have their own interests to try to maintain their position. So the informational landscape has been kind of enclosed in this really, really scary way. And of course, I don't want to let social media off the hook. They know most of this. They have internal research and programs that discover most of this, and they don't care. They want to pour as much gasoline on the fire as possible as an accelerant to the overall crisis, because attention is their business model. So, to bring this back to the beginning, fake news is fake news. It's a silly phrase, but now we can understand that if you want to blame technology or you want to just use concepts like fake news, you miss out on all of this kind of much more joined up thinking in terms of how misinformation is being produced. And that gives you a map for understanding how not only our understanding of misinformation has been kind of changed, but also how our misunderstanding of other things has been changed as well. So misinformation has to be seen as an active process that's not only occluding our view of it, but our view of everything else. Right? So if we learn to see the ways that misinformation functions, we can understand the processes by which we are deprived of understanding that issue and also many other issues as well. And that's my hope. And that was the reason why I felt we needed to kind of have a conversation, a much better conversation about misinformation and the kind of problem that it is. Thank you very much. I think we actually, because I went quite quickly, we do have a little bit of time.
Yeah.
That 10-minute thing spooked me, and I went really quickly. So we've got 5 minutes or something, I think, for some Q&A, if anyone does have any questions. If we don't get to them, I will be at the media meetup area later at 2:15. I think it's, mine said 2:15 to 3:15.
We'll check that out in the next 5 minutes.
Okay. Yes, but I was looking at it on the program of the website. Anyway, okay, so ignore this then. Listen to this gentleman instead.
So it's 1 hour later.
Information for you. I would just keep testing you.
Brilliant.
Yeah, so I'll take the questions. Hi.
I would like to know, do you have an answer how to deal with people who are actually believing fake news? Do you think it's worth it to try to make them believe the real news? Or do you think they're just like stupid, fuck it and leave it?
That's a very good question. I've been in lots of those conversations and I've had mixed results. I think sometimes people are just slightly misinformed because, you know, as I said, we all have resentments, we all have suspicion, and quite often misinformation functions to direct those things towards the wrong targets. So I think depending on how close you are to the person and how far gone they are as far as the rabbit hole of believing, you know, different forms of misinformation, you'll have a different outcome. I mean, I have a friend whose mother is a conspiracy theorist, completely like anti-vax, New World Order, Illuminati, everything. And there's no point. There is no point. You just have to just try and find other more social, you know, just not talk about the issues. But in other cases, you know, I've had a lot of more productive conversations with people. And I recently had a conversation with someone who for 15 years was a truther, you know, believing in the Illuminati and all that kind of stuff, and managed to surface and realize that his whole worldview was wrong, and now is trying to kind of go and help educate other people that are out of those beliefs as a former believer himself. So, I mean, I think there's always a ray of hope, but there's never easy conversations.
Well, I feel like the group of people believing the fake news is kind of getting bigger and bigger, and it's hard to aim at them because they are starting to...
The micro is not working.
Okay. I feel like the group of people believing the misinformations is getting bigger and bigger. I'm talking about, for instance, the Trump people. It's obvious he's lying, and they're still believing it. And this group gets bigger and bigger, and I feel like this is actually a real problem for us. And is it worth it to still target these people, or is it like we just need to live with it because it's part of the time we're living at?
That's why I'm so interested in trying to kind of make a broader picture of misinformation that enables us to see the causes, because I think in some cases you can't, like with a fire, you can put it out with water, but with something like this, you have to kind of go and deal with the cause over here, and then eventually, over time, the problem will start subsiding. But as long as we have a world that is very corrupt, where there is a lot of lying, where there is a lot of kind of strategic misinformation, those people will always have something they can point at, even if they're completely wrong about most things. It's a huge problem, and it is getting worse. But we have to kind of, I think, take a systemic approach really to addressing the causes, and hope that maybe in 10 years' time things will be better.
We have many more questions, but I have to refer to the meetup area. Sorry. Sure. We have many more questions, but I have to refer to the meetup area later, unfortunately, because we have to close the talk today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Marcus.